I would like to thank everyone for being here, and I would like to thank also the JFK Historical Group for having me, and I'd like to thank David and, of course, Ed Tatro. The topic of my presentation this morning, Assimilating the Anguish, will not focus so much on the details of the assassination as it will on the outcomes. The time for critics for the Warren Report to be hungry for all of the details, in the hope that we might be able to piece together the facts and interpret the evidence so that the truth will eventually emerge as the product of our labor, has passed. After all, 50 years have come and gone since the issuance of that abominable report, and so I think a longer view is perhaps in order. At least it is for me. You know, before I start, I'd like to first briefly describe the process I went through in preparation for this conference. I can assure you that there is a drawback to providing the organizers of any conference with the name of your presentation prior to you having written the presentation. After all, the title might be printed on brochures or in press releases, and then, of course, you're stuck with it. But please don't misunderstand. I am very pleased that I locked in this title early, because if I hadn't, I'm uncertain I would have been courageous enough to broach the subject of anguish. But here I am, and that's what I'm going to do. But from the start, nearly 50 years ago, critics of the Warren Report have been seeking a breakthrough, a quantum leap, if you will, to resolve this case. But what we've been looking for, and to do that exclusively, it's been looked at from without ourselves, and the evidence, and the top secret documents, and the Oval Office tapes, and the Air Force One tapes, and so forth. But I submit to you the breakthrough we seek resides within each one of us. It is therefore entirely within our own control to change the paradigm under which we labor. But first, we must choose to feel it, which brings me back to anguish. There are several dangers, if you will, to such a subject. The first is mainly culture. In our culture, men are not supposed to cry, particularly in public, unless, of course, it's at the national anthem. Yet this subject remains raw in my heart, and whenever I speak of it, I feel it. And it is from the emotion of anguish that I am compelled to continue the battle. Without it, I would have given up on this a long time ago. Just the other day, I shared my concerns about my speaking on this topic with a good friend of mine. I told him that I was somewhat concerned due to the emotional content and how often it makes me feel rather raw. And he said to me, "Greg, thought without feeling is the definition of artificial intelligence." And I thank you for that, Charles Drago. And you know, so often I think I've heard others, and I've probably felt this myself at times, a bit of a disappointment with the Kennedy family for not stepping forward. And I first want to say, you know, how dare me, in one way, how dare me. I have not walked in their shoes. I wouldn't want to, and I don't know how I would react. But what do we know? We know that the patriarch of the Kennedy family, Joseph P. Kennedy, had a mantra within the home, if you all recall. Kennedys don't cry. Kennedys don't cry, at least not in public. And I can't imagine any of them talking about this in public. I think Bobby Kennedy Jr. acted very courageously last year when he broached the subject for the first time. But we're all waiting for Caroline. And when I say that, I don't mean it disrespectfully or to put any type of pressure. But I think some of us do. We still want that. And yet, this anguish, this overwhelming anguish that we all feel must be multiplied how many times over in her life. So I give her a pass. Fighting for a cause that has been so mired in uncertainty is not for the faint of heart. And I think that is the point of creating the uncertainty. The original perpetrators of the crime of obstruction of justice in the Kennedy assassination were never afraid of getting caught, not for a second. But those who continue to obstruct should be quite concerned, because the jig's up. Thomas Jefferson once said, "If we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education." Think about that for a second, folks. Yet the Warren Commission set out to do the exact opposite, didn't they? Rather than discover all of the facts that were discoverable and then disclose them to the American people, the Warren Commission created more questions than it answered, and it didn't ask the right questions when it was asking them. As a collateral damage manager, the Commission was mainly reactive to the volatility of an arguably certifiable occupant of the Oval Office, reactive to the existence of evidence that ran counter to the lone assassin theory, reactive to any eyewitness testimony that contradicted the predetermined conclusion, and reactive to perhaps the most dangerous element of the assassination, the anguish of we the people. If the Warren Commission report had been intended to be the means by which the American people could assimilate their anguish, it would have created a nice, neat, tidy package. But it didn't. It created a monstrosity instead, rife with contradictions, omissions, fabrications, and outright lies. Those who planned the assassination and the ensuing cover-up created conflicting evidence at nearly every turn. There now appears to be compelling evidence that multiple persons were using the identity of Lee Harvey Oswald and were cited in various times and places, sometimes even simultaneously. There appears to be more than one Mannlicher Carcano either entered into record or on display. There is evidence of non-lethal but serious wounds to both the president and the governor, and of course evidence of lethal wounds to the president. But there are also some very mysterious, if not almost nonsensical, superficial wounds, such as the shallow, non-transiting back wound. And there is evidence that the autopsy x-rays and or photographs have been altered. There is a direct conflict between the Parkland doctors and trauma team in Dallas, their reports, versus what was reported by the doctors during the autopsy at Bethesda. There are multiple caskets reported as having contained the body of the dead president, one a cheap grayish-colored shipping casket used for fallen soldiers on a battlefield, and the other an ornate ceremonial casket. In one, the president is reported as having arrived in a body bag, and in the other, the president is reported as having arrived at Bethesda wrapped in sheets in a plastic lining to protect the ornate ceremonial casket. There is compelling evidence of the existence of at least one film of the assassination that is in conflict with the extant films of the assassination. And of course, we even have two official government investigations into the crime that each arrived at diametrically opposed conclusions. The Warren report made a patsy of Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin, while the House Select Committee on Assassinations didn't give him a pass, but they made patsies of organized crime in the anti-Castro Cubans. And we also have the Oval Office tapes, of course, where within the first few days after the assassination, J. Edgar Hoover is talking to LBJ, and LBJ says, "How is it that Connally got hit?" And paraphrasing, LBJ says, "Well, he turned and he got hit in that turning." And he says, "Well, were all the shots fired at the president?" And Hoover says, oh yeah. "Well, would he have been hit by all of them if Connally hadn't turned?" And Hoover says, "Absolutely. If Connally hadn't have been in the way, the president would have been hit by all shots." Hoover just told LBJ there was a shot from the front, didn't he? At no time was Connally behind JFK. So we have that as well. Rather than going farther into this ever-growing list of doppelgangers and red herrings, I submit that those in control of this operation planned on all of these inconsistencies being discovered and pondered and debated ad nauseum. I think researchers have been honestly searching for the truth in these matters, thinking they're going to get to the end of it somehow, not considering that this was planned. This wasn't slipshod. This wasn't accidental. Oops, we're trying to keep up with the evidence. Hopefully nobody will know. This was planned, folks, in advance. You can see it. The machination is there. And the more that we discover, it continues. Like I said, their plan did not focus on getting away with it. That was a foregone conclusion. Their plan was to thoroughly and forever muddy the waters so that the truth will never be known. Their goal has never been to convince anyone that the lies are the truth. Their goal was to forever create a state of uncertainty that would be reinforced with each new discovery. Indeed, the enslavement of the American psyche through the involuntary abandonment of critical thinking could hardly have been accomplished otherwise. Vince Salandria had it right when he said, "The interests of those who killed Kennedy now transcend national boundaries and national priorities. No doubt we are dealing with an international conspiracy. We must face that fact and not waste any more time microanalyzing the evidence. That's exactly what they want us to do. They have kept us busy for so long." Indeed, they have. I should think that the majority of researchers who criticize the Warren Commission have, at least at one time or another, if not often, felt offended that the government would take us for such fools. We have protested in righteous indignation that our own government has deceived us, and we have demanded that they come clean. But to what end? We have called for the release of all assassination-related documents, as if such release will actually shed any more light on the subject. Then we find out that the Secret Service admits to having destroyed many of their documents on the subject in defiance of the JFK Act, as did the Office of Naval Intelligence, among others. Still, like innocent children traveling to a favorite vacation destination with our parents, we ask, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Over and over again. But why? Only when we cease using their virus-ridden GPS will we stop driving in circles, folks. I submit that we get out of the car and use our own moral and reason compass to determine our exact location. Now, some might find it appropriate that we gather here in a hotel that bears the word Crown in its name as we discuss the death of American royalty. But JFK was no king. Still, the name Crown seems somewhat appropriate to me, as its significance resides in the fact that the code name for the White House Situation Room in 1963 was Crown. And it was from Crown that the occupants of both Air Force One and the cabinet members aboard Dean Russ State Department plane were informed, almost immediately following the assassination, of what was to become the very same conclusion reached by the Warren Commission some 10 months later, namely that JFK was killed as a result of actions taken by a lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. However, at the time Crown presciently identified him as the guilty party, Lee Harvey Oswald had yet to even be charged with the crime of assassinating President Kennedy. The Dallas Police Department would not charge him with that crime till almost midnight. Moreover, the new president wouldn't even conceive of his so-called blue ribbon commission for several more days. Yet Crown had already solved the crime. They solved it before the Dallas police had gotten a statement from the accused. They solved it before the FBI had begun to investigate, and solved it before the Warren Commission had even been conceived of. Indeed, Crown solved the crime without examining any of the evidence or interviewing even a single witness. Moreover, the cabinet was even informed of Oswald's background, including his having defected to the Soviet Union and his alleged involvement with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, while the cabinet was still 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean on their way to Tokyo for an economic summit. And even when the Air Force One tapes were finally obtained and more smoking guns revealed, it changed nothing. It did not reinforce my certainty that there was a conspiracy. It's like gravity. I need no further evidence. But they keep getting it to us somehow, don't they? Little by little. Most of it contradicts other evidence. Now I'm going to change gears here for a moment and talk briefly about Vietnam. Don't worry, I'm not going to revisit a familiar subject that I've covered elsewhere just to rehash items that I've already established, and I'm certainly not going to make the case for conspiracy based on this. I think that case has already been made. Instead, I'll draw on a different perspective for emphasis. Specifically, I want to talk about what appears to be a directive leveled at the very heart of the Kennedy administration on November 22nd, 1963, and collectively aimed at the American body politic ever since. I want to emphasize that what I'm about to discuss has value, but not because it is more evidence of conspiracy, but because it allows us a glimpse of the mechanisms here at work. Those of you who are familiar with my work and the work of others on National Security Action Memorandums 263 and 273 will recall the fact that in October of '63, Kennedy ordered 1,000 troops home from Vietnam by Christmas of that year, and the remainder of all personnel, U.S. personnel out of Vietnam, pardon me, by the end of 1965. You'll further recall that 6 weeks later, on November 21st, 1963, the evening before the assassination, JFK's Special Assistant on National Security, Mr. McGeorge Bundy, wrote the draft of National Security Action Memorandum 273, which reversed JFK's Vietnam policy before JFK could even be briefed on the talks from the Honolulu Conference that ostensibly had led to the Vietnam policy changes contained within the document. The draft of this document was widely disseminated throughout the government that very night, including reaching those cabinet members who were bound for Japan the next day aboard one of the planes in the presidential fleet then being used by Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Now, I've often wondered why the draft of a National Security Action Memorandum dealing with Vietnam policy would have been circulated to cabinet members who were extraneous to Vietnam policy while they were en route to an economic summit in Tokyo. Secretary of State Dean Rusk was certainly involved in Vietnam policy, but he was the only person aboard that flight who had attended the Honolulu Conference. Surely any of the other cabinet members who were in Honolulu would have been required to attend the conference had their presence been integral, but they were not. They arrived in Hawaii the evening of November 21st after the conference had concluded. Now, is it conceivable that the following cabinet members were essential to Vietnam policy decision-making processes, but were not required to attend the conference? Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon. Put your hands up if any of these you think were integral to Vietnam policy. Interior Secretary Stuart Udall. Labor Secretary Willard Wirtz. Secretary of Commerce Luther Hodges, and Secretary of Agriculture Orville Freeman. Clearly, the answer is no. So we must ask, was there anything being communicated in the draft of NSAM 273 that was not related to Vietnam policy, but was apparently related to the cabinet or essential for them to know? The answer may be contained in paragraph 4, which reads, "It is of the highest importance that the United States government avoid either the appearance or the reality of public recrimination from one part of it against another. And the President expects that all senior officers of the government will take energetic steps to ensure that they and their subordinates go out of their way to maintain and to defend the unity of the United States government, both here and in the field." What could he be talking about? There's a couple of possibilities. Now, again, I want to emphasize, I'm not bringing this up to say McGeorge Bundy had foreknowledge, although if you've seen my presentation a few years ago at COPA, I go into that in great depth. And so I recommend that if you're more interested in that. And I certainly believe that he did have foreknowledge. But that's not my point here. My point's something else. If you'll indulge me, let's go on an imaginary trip to Tokyo, or at least think we're on our way to Tokyo. Let's climb aboard the State Department plane momentarily and ponder the magnitude of what the cabinet members learned during that flight. Of particular interest to me is that one specific paragraph copied above, in which McGeorge Bundy, who in light of the tragic events of the next day, appears to be speaking not for JFK, but for LBJ. Now, when you look at the rest of the document, I think you'll see that more clearly than just from this small portion here. But if you were on the aircraft, a member of the cabinet, JFK is the president. Nothing's happened. So in your head, this is a JFK directive, okay? Now, why do I say that that Bundy was apparently speaking for LBJ? First, we know that JFK was never going to approve or sign this document, as it reversed a policy that he had implemented only 6 weeks earlier, and it was a policy that was based on his meticulously dictated McNamara-Taylor trip report. And second, JFK never even saw this document, as he was on a very, very tight trip in Texas, a trip that he would never return from alive. As I said in my COPA 2010 presentation, that paragraph sounds to me as if there was about to be a coup d'etat. After all, the wording in paragraph 4 of the draft fits the occasion to perfection. And indeed, the next day, President Kennedy was killed. But the purpose of my bringing this up today goes far beyond the implications of Bundy's foreknowledge, as I said. It is deeper, darker, and much uglier than all that. Now let's get back aboard the airplane. Imagine yourself for a minute, and really do this with me if you might. Imagine yourself being on that aircraft. Further imagine you are a member of the president's cabinet, President Kennedy's cabinet. Imagine you're the Secretary of Agriculture. First, you are inexplicably handed the draft of NSAM 273, which in and of itself is highly unusual, given that your position in the government does not afford you a need-to-know status regarding top-secret Vietnam policy. Second, you read the portion that says, I'm paraphrasing, it's very important that we don't publicly accuse each other of something, and the president, currently JFK, expects us to maintain and defend the unity of the United States government. Now, I want you to imagine yourself doing something else, scratching your head, see, because that's what I'd have been doing. Next, you learn that there has been an assassination attempt in Dallas. It's coming over a teletype. Next, you find out that the president may have been hit in the head. It's coming over a teletype. Minutes that feel like days pass, and then the word comes in, the president's dead. And then directly from Crown, the Situation Room, we know who did it. Lee Harvey Oswald. They told them the name. They told them it was a lone assassin. They told him he had defected to the Soviet Union, and he was a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. But we got him. There's nothing more to see here, folks. Move on. Imagine yourself, Secretary of Agriculture. Imagine what would have been going through your mind at that moment. Again, let's pause for a minute to review and let this really sink in. You are handed a top-secret document, the draft of an NSAM, which has absolutely nothing to do with your area of expertise nor your area of concern, and within it you are directed by what appears to be the sitting president, JFK, to maintain and defend the unity of the United States government. Quite mystifying indeed. Until that sitting president's brain is splattered across Dealey Plaza. Suddenly, the directive to refrain from recrimination and the directive to defend the unity of the government each acquires context. Some people have fallaciously argued that Bundy was referring in paragraph 4 to the controversial nature of conflicting views regarding the Vietnam War, which were discussed at the Honolulu conference. First of all, we must be reminded of the nature of these talks from which this document was supposedly spawned. NSAM 273 draft was ostensibly written as a result of what type of talks, folks, at the Honolulu conference? Top secret talks. The content from the conference was also classified as what? Top secret. Therefore, Bundy could not have been referring to Vietnam policy in the paragraph, because policy discussions that are conducted in a top secret meeting will not be available to the public to see or know about, nor will the participants be allowed to argue them outside of a top secret setting. Therefore, there was no possibility of public recrimination occurring to begin with in the context of the Honolulu Conference and Vietnam policy. This is further evidenced by the fact that the vast majority of Americans, even historians, remain unaware of the content of the Honolulu Conference to this very day. Of course, the value to the conspirators of the induced cognitive dissonance cannot be overstated. During the following days and weeks, there were conversations throughout the government in which speculation about possible involvement by various agencies, from the Secret Service to the CIA to the FBI, were beginning to be murmured ever so quietly. And whenever one of these conversations took place within earshot of an NSAM 273 draft recipient, it was quickly and thoroughly discredited, even by members of President Kennedy's own cabinet. And we've always wondered why. Well, perhaps now we know. It was in order to do what? It was in order to avoid either the appearance or the reality of public recrimination from one part of the government against another, in order to maintain and defend the unity of the United States government, both here and abroad. And you know, during trauma, sometimes things get melded together. Easy for me to say, a cabinet member who was reading the one document and the news all comes in. And you know, I don't claim to know the order. The news may have come in first, and they may have gotten the document second about, you know, the NSAM, the paragraph 4 I was talking about. Almost doesn't matter. Point is, the events get merged together. The events get merged together. The scope of the psychological warfare employed here, and before, during, and after this event, is the actual operation. The assassination was but one very critical phase of it. You know, they say the ignition for a stick of dynamite starts with the lighting of a match, but the explosion that follows dwarfs the magnitude of the match. I submit to you that the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, as horrific as it was and is dwarfed not so much by the ensuing cover-up, but by the depth and scope of the resultant power to psychologically enslave the American people through the destruction of critical thinking. But Warren Report apologists ignore all of that and so much more. I pay no attention to them anymore, really. It's a waste of time and effort. But occasionally something attracts my attention. You know, just the other day I was looking up, you know, poems on friendship for somebody that, you know, I wanted to send them a thank you card. And actually, I should be honest and say that my wife urged me to send this person a thank you card, because otherwise I would have gone, well, they know that I appreciate this. So I'm, you know, I can write fairly well, but thank you cards I'm having trouble with. So I'm looking up friendship things, and I serendipitously stumbled upon a quote from Abraham Lincoln that I had never heard before. He said, "I destroy my enemies when I make them my friends." Powerful words. I destroy my enemies. I keyed on that word. So I immediately went down to the flower shop. I got 24 olive branches, and I had one sent to the 6th floor museum and the other to Marquette University. You see, it's that kind of a subject. Now I'm going to change gears. Jack Kennedy loved to compete. Of this, there is no doubt. Whether it was competing with his brothers Joe and Bobby in touch football at Hyannisport or on the football field while in college, Jack loved to win. He was said to be decent, if not accomplished, at golf while president, and of course his career in politics was filled with competition and competitiveness. Still, President Kennedy was remembered as a good sport that neither gloated when victorious nor sulked in defeat. And this nature spilled over into his foreign policy, as seen when he refused to rub Nikita Khrushchev's nose in it at the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy knew that there would always be challenges in life and challenges to life. That's the human condition, and perhaps it's the way that we would prefer it if we had the choice as human beings. But too often, challenge evolves into conflict, particularly when competition for limited resources exists. Societal competition has several possible outcomes. Some are desired, and some not so much. As an example, the law of supply and demand will, of course, influence prices. And so it is in the interest of the greedy to promote the perception of a threatened or grossly limited supply in order to foment competition for their product, driving prices up and thus increasing profits. But increased conflict is directly proportional to increased competition. Conversely, as competition is reduced through either the perception or the reality of plenty, so is conflict reduced. Now, that's not to imply that all competition is to be avoided. Healthy competition has often spurred man to great heights of achievement, but competition for the basic necessities to sustain human life in the modern world, such as shelter, food, oil for heating and transportation, and so much more, will result in conflict. In such an environment, good people look to government for solutions in order to avoid resorting to banditry. And those in government are tasked, therefore, with finding means to encourage businesses that provide basic necessities to citizens to refrain from seeking unreasonable profit and to submit to regulation. This solution works well when implemented properly. A simple example of its success can be observed with regards to utility companies that provide gas and electricity for the most part. We do not see families fighting with each other, locked in armed conflict as a result of competing for these services. And competition, of course, can have a very tonic effect on athletic performance, as can be seen and observed in the Olympic Games or any professional sport. But when chronic competition enters into games for survival or into games of greed, it becomes lethal. And in what scenario does competition for survival and competition for greed both simultaneously exist? The state of war. If we have a perception of scarcity, that there's not enough to go around, that leads to unhealthy competition. Competition to survive. Competition to be powerful and wealthy, greed. And that leads to conflict, and on an international scale, that can lead easily to war. We've seen it often. So it's not difficult to see competition for greed as a war's motivation, and it's certainly easy to see competition for survival at play on the battlefield itself. But I submit that an unhealthy competition for either profit or for survival is at the very heart of the problems we faced in 1963, much as it is today. I believe that President Kennedy recognized this from very early on in his life, and he carried it into his presidency. He recognized that peace was unattainable, both domestically and between nations, when the competitive stakes were too high, and that only when the perceived necessity for unhealthy competition was reduced could a sustainable peace be assured. Why peace, we might ask? Was it to guarantee the comforts of liberty, or was it simply to reduce the threat of potentially self-destructive foreign policy? Or was it much more than that? JFK believed a peaceful atmosphere would more readily allow technological advances and educational opportunities the chance to flourish, thus providing hope for the future and the means and motivation to fight the common enemies of man that he delineated in his inaugural address: tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. He knew that by reducing the perceived necessity for unhealthy competition between individuals, between races, between religions, between businesses, between industries, and finally between nations, that liberty can and will survive. President Kennedy challenges us to almost literally reverse our perception, choosing to believe as if there is enough to go around, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. Why? Was he merely challenging us to be delusional? Or was there a deeper lesson to be learned? Perhaps the key idea is more tied to perception than it is to reality. When individuals believe that they will get their fair share, they don't tend to infringe on their neighbor's fair share. Communities tend to cooperate. They tend to thrive. Generosity, all of a sudden, becomes part of the equation. Self-realization. Peace. How many times did Kennedy say peace in his speeches? Every single speech. And how did he attempt to get us there? He said, there's plenty. You see, it's all about perception. You know, not asking anybody to look around the room, so please don't. But I'm just going to pick something at random. Okay? Right now, if anybody is thinking about what I'm about to say, raise your hand when I say it. There's a rather large, it looks like, ventilation system on that back wall with, vents in it. Anybody thinking about that? No. So at that moment when I brought it up before you looked, right, it didn't exist. But if I've earned any of your trust, even for such a trivial thing, you probably would take my word for it, right? Okay, it's probably back there. So that's how we've treated government for a long time, isn't it? It's how we've treated the media for a long time, right? We're a blank slate. I mean, every day we wake up, we're a blank slate. Think about it. We recreate our day every morning when we get up. And it's based on the past. It's also based on our immediate now situation. And it's also based on our ambition for the future, or our dread of the future, as the case may be. So creating perceptions for people, you see, it's interesting because, well, you could say, well, it's a lie, isn't it? Well, is it or is it? I mean, in a sense, it's not, because there's so much that exists around me that I'm totally not aware of, you see? So what is perception? Perception is this narrow focus, okay? So how do we get to the truth through this narrow focus? Kennedy had the ability to focus us. And when you become focused on a perception, the perception can become real. Because in fact, the perception may be real. In fact, there could be opposing perceptions, a perception of plenty and a perception of scarcity, depending on how you spin it. And then how you accept it instructs how you behave. Kennedy's whole aim, I believe, was to instruct us on how to behave through gaining control of our own perceptions of what's possible. That's what he called us to do. While Kennedy remained suspicious of specific individuals and ideology, there was something metaphysical in JFK's approach to governance, an existentialism of sorts, based in his deep trust in the human spirit. When JFK was killed, he was on his way to the Trade Mart, and he was going to give a speech there. And we never got to hear that speech. I hope all of you have read that speech. It's an important speech, I mean, it could be argued, and I'm certainly not making the argument, but it could be argued that this is the speech that got him killed. This is a speech he wasn't supposed to make. Now, I know I'm being a bit trite when I say that, but it was a very important speech. And I've read it several times. And every time I either watch JFK say anything, whether it was a news conference where he was being animated and affable and engaging, or whether it was an important speech about the Cuban Missile Crisis, or during the Bay of Pigs when he took responsibility, when he'd been sabotaged, when he talked about peace over and over again. All of these things were so inspiring then, they're inspiring now. I can read it today. I can hear it today. But when you only read it, it's not quite the same. And I don't know how we'll ever be able to imagine what it would have been like. And it's kind of a long speech, but the very end of it is kind of interesting.
My friends and fellow citizens, I cite these facts and figures to make it clear that America today is stronger than ever before. Our adversaries have not abandoned their ambitions. Our dangers have not diminished. Our vigilance cannot be relaxed. But now we have the military, the scientific and the economic strength to do whatever must be done for the preservation and promotion of freedom. The strength will never be used in pursuit of aggressive ambitions. It will always be used in pursuit of peace. It will never be used to promote provocations. It will always be used to promote the peaceful settlement of disputes. We in this country, in this generation, are by destiny rather than by choice the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For as was written long ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain.
Certainly a speech I would have liked to hear, and a lot more of them. Too often we enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. It's a quote from JFK. So when you apply it to the Warren Commission report, and you apply it to all, please don't think I'm denigrating anybody here. All of us have put so much time and effort into this. And I'm going to use the word guilty. I am just as guilty as everybody as this focus on evidence, on document release, on putting the pieces together and trying to figure this out. And then I read those words. Because a lot of people have their quote-unquote pet theory, you know? I mean, when people find out what I do and how involved I am in this, sometimes they'll ask me, so who done it? Oh, so you're a conspiracy theorist. Now, no, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I have no theory. I have no theory. I know what happened. I know Lee Oswald did not act alone, and I'm pretty certain he didn't act at all. So I know it didn't happen. That's important, folks. We all know what didn't happen. I don't need to see one more thing fall off the table and go, oh yeah, look, I think there's something called gravity. See, I don't need that. Come on, look at everything we've got. We're way beyond that. We're way beyond it. So I think that we owe something to JFK. I know that I do. And this is the difficult part of my talk that I've been avoiding. How do you assimilate the anguish? It's not just JFK. This is about what it means. We've been focused so long on what it is, what this is, what that is. But this is about what it means on a much grander scale. What it means to Americans. Beyond that, what it means to humans. What it means that we can be absolutely certain that we've been lied to. This is not a question. We know. Let's not talk about what we know what happened, the specifics of the assassination. We know what didn't happen, which means we know we were lied to. There is no question about it. That's where our focus needs to be. Not on how we were, how many times we were, and find out exactly what happened and say, okay, we got these two bits of evidence, they're contradictory, and guess what? We figured out this one's crap and this one's good. We've been doing that. And again, please don't take this the wrong way. Everyone has their own approach. But I submit to you that the change that needs to occur needs to change within. We have to find a new paradigm to approach this if we're actually to effect change. And not change just for the justice and truth in the JFK assassination, but effect change for justice in our country and in the world. It is our responsibility now. It's not his anymore. And if we figured out exactly what happened to that man that day, it will not help us change our world today. What's going to help us change our world today is us, is our commitment. And we have to do it as he did it, without fear, or at least project the perception that you're not afraid. I thank you for your time.